Hello, welcome back to AAI Beyond. In this video, we will discuss the storyline of the fantasy series, The Lord of the Rings, The Rings of Power, Season 2. In this season, Sauron employs various tricks to obtain the Rings of Power, which he will use to dominate Middle-earth. Curious about Sauron's cunning and who his targets are? Let's watch this video until the end. But before we dive into the story, I want to remind you that this content contains full spoilers. Don't forget to like, comment, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell. Without further ado, let's get straight into the storyline. Shortly after the dark power of Morgoth was defeated by the elves, Morgoth's loyal followers gathered to determine their future. In this moment, Sauron declared his determination to seek new power in order to carry out his main mission to dominate the world of Middle-earth. Sauron then invited Ardar and his leading orcs to assist in this mission, as if it succeeded, they would all be able to act as they pleased in Middle-earth. After his speech, Sauron intended to establish himself as the new Dark Lord, replacing Morgoth. However, unexpectedly, Ardar and his forces opposed this proclamation because they believed Sauron was merely making false promises. Ultimately, Sauron was attacked by the orcs and severely injured. In his critical condition, Sauron unleashed a magical attack that sent Ardar's forces flying and turned the place into a frozen wasteland. After this attack, Sauron's body vanished without a trace. As a result, Ardar believed that Sauron was dead from the earlier assault. Now, the orcs recognized Ardar as the new leader worthy of replacing Morgoth. However, unbeknownst to them, Sauron was still alive. After successfully escaping, Sauron began consuming every animal he encountered to regain his strength. Then, after preying on a human, Sauron managed to acquire a new form. From that moment on, Sauron disguised himself as a human named Halbrand and continued to wander. Thousands of years later, Halbrand accidentally encountered the inhabitants of the Southern Realm who were fleeing from their homeland due to an orc attack. Halbrand then had a conversation with a man we will call James. It turned out that James was a servant of the Southern Kingdom and he carried an identification badge that symbolized the king of that land. That night, Halbrand joined the Southern inhabitants in their escape. However, when their ship was attacked by a sea monster, Halbrand managed to seize James's identification badge, which he was about to lose along with many other fleeing people. Halbrand eventually used this identification badge to disguise himself as the king of the Southern Realm. Time went on until Halbrand met Galadriel and formed a close friendship with her. However, they ultimately parted ways after Galadriel uncovered Halbrand's true identity as Sauron. Back in the present, Halbrand is now in Mordor, which is under Ardar's control. Halbrand is captured by Ardar after he fails to persuade him to free the southern inhabitants who have become his slaves. After being imprisoned and tortured for a long time, Halbrand begins to devise a scheme to carry out his evil plan. In front of Ardar, Halbrand claims that Sauron is still alive and has returned in a new form. However, to conceal his true identity, Halbrand states that he does not know Sauron's new appearance. Halbrand then offers a deal that would be very beneficial for Ardar. If he is freed, he will try to convince his people to track down Sauron's location, allowing Ardar to destroy Sauron once he is found. To demonstrate his seriousness, Halbrand swears loyalty to Ardar. Trusting Halbrand's promise, Ardar ultimately releases him. Halbrand then appears to smile with satisfaction, having successfully deceived Ardar and his forces. Meanwhile, in Lindon, Galadriel is pursuing Elrond to seize the three powerful rings now known as the Rings of Power. After failing to obtain the rings, Galadriel is brought before Gil-galad, the Elven king. In this moment, Gil-galad finally learns Halbrand's true identity as Sauron, thanks to a report from Elrond. Gil-galad then gives a stern reprimand to Galadriel, explaining that she was deceived by Sauron's disguise as Halbrand, and thus unwittingly helped Sauron rise again and become a significant threat to both the elves and Middle-earth. Gil-galad then orders Elrond to surrender the 3 rings of power he is carrying, as these rings are the only hope to save the elven race and Middle-earth from darkness and Sauron. However, Elrond refuses because he is determined to destroy the rings to prevent them from falling into Sauron's hands. Elrond is ultimately forced to flee and seek out Círdan, the oldest and wisest elf in Middle-earth. At Elrond's urging, Círdan agrees to help him destroy the rings. A few days later, Galadriel represents Gil-galad in asking Elrond to surrender the rings, but it turns out that Elrond has already given the rings to Círdan, who is now heading somewhere as if he intends to destroy the rings. Meanwhile, Nori and Stranger continue their journey to Rhûn, a land in the desert that they hope will restore Stranger's memories of his true identity. While they are lost, Nori accidentally encounters her friend, Poppy. It turns out that Poppy has been secretly following Nori to assist her on the journey. Poppy then shows Nori a map created based on the travels of the Harfoot people. Thanks to this map, Stranger finally manages to find the way to Rhûn. Kembali ku linden serdorn yarn suder. Menyadari dasiatnya kekuartan sinsin akhernir baruber pikran dengan menyarakan sinsin kepader Gil-galad Círdan Gil-galad dan Galadriel lalu sepakat untuk memakai ketigar sinsin tersebut dalam sekejap kekuartan sinsin ini berhasil memulihkan cahaya sumber energi kekuartan elf yang sebelumnya tiris merdup akibat kegelapan yang semakin kuat semur elf di sana termasuk. Elrond pun senang melihat pemulihan ini bagaimanapun Elrond sebenarnya masih kuarti sinsin itu akan diabut ol Sauron beberapa waktu. Kemudian Halbrand. Tiber di region kotor elf yang menjadi tempat pembuatan sinsin Halbrand kemudian berusaha menemui Celebrimbor pandai besar yang menjadi pencipta sinsin kekuasaan usai mengetahui kedatangan Halbrand Celebrimbor memerintahkan anak buahnya untuk meminta Halbrand segera pergi karena sebelumnya Celebrimbor sudah berjanji kepada Galadriel untuk tidak berhubungan dengan Halbrand lagi jika Halbrand kembali muncul. Meanwhile, in the kingdom of Khazad-dûm, Prince Durin now lives as an ordinary person after being exiled by his father for trying to defend Elrond. While Durin is with his wife, Disa, the kingdom is suddenly struck by an earthquake. As a result of this disaster, the dwarf kingdom located inside the mountain loses a crucial area that has long served as a source of sunlight. With sunlight unable to enter the mountain, all the farmers' crops begin to wither, threatening their food supply. To address this issue, King Durin sends a skilled stone miner named Narvi to search for a new safe area in the mountain to serve as a source of sunlight. Narvi then explains that the earthquake that shook the kingdom was a result of a volcanic eruption in Mordor. Since the earthquake occurred, some of the populace believes that the dark energy from Mordor has begun to touch their kingdom, causing them to live in anxiety. After Narvi departs to carry out his task, Disa urges the king to reconcile with his son, Prince Durin. Unfortunately, both the king and the prince are proud and stubborn, preventing their conflict from being resolved. Shifting to Stranger, he finally arrives in Rhûn with Nori and Poppy. Shortly thereafter, Stranger accidentally discovers an object resembling a staff that he often sees in his nightmares. While Stranger is still contemplating this discovery, a group of hunters suddenly arrives to capture him. It turns out that these hunters are sent by a sorcerer named Dark Wizard, who happens to reside in Rhûn, and the Dark Wizard is the boss of the female sorcerer that Stranger previously defeated. Long story short, Stranger manages to fend off the group of hunters with a storm created from his magical powers. However, since Stranger is still unable to control his powers, the storm cannot be stopped, resulting in Nori and Poppy being separated from Stranger due to the strong winds. On the other hand, Galadriel recounts the effects she has experienced since wearing the Ring of Power. It turns out that this ring causes Galadriel to have terrifying dreams that she fears may come true. Unexpectedly, Gil-galad also experiences the same effects since wearing the ring. However, the difference between their nightmares is that Galadriel's dream shows the death of Celebrimbor, while Gil-galad's nightmare depicts the collapse of a mountain, which is likely the mountain of the kingdom of Khazad-dûm. From this dream, Galadriel has a premonition that Sauron is trying to get close to Celebrimbor in Eregion. Galadriel is also convinced that Sauron is now very much after the Rings of Power, as their tremendous power could fulfill Sauron's ambition to dominate Middle-earth. It turns out that Galadriel can guess Sauron's line of thought because she once had a close relationship with him. Galadriel asked Gil-galad for permission to go to Eregion to protect Celebrimbor from the evil influence of Sauron. However, Gil-galad would only allow her to go if she was accompanied by Elrond. He emphasized that he set this condition because he did not want Galadriel to be deceived by Sauron again. Unfortunately, Elrond refused Galadriel's request to accompany her to Eregion because he was very disappointed to see his friend wearing the Rings of Power. Elrond then warned that Celebrimbor had managed to create the rings thanks to input from Halbrand, aka Sauron. This is why Elrond believed that anyone who wore a ring was essentially drawn into Sauron's evil game. Shortly thereafter, Elrond shared Galadriel's predicament with Círdan, the wisest of the elves. Círdan advised Elrond to accompany Galadriel to Eregion so that he could protect her from Sauron's deception. Elrond ultimately followed Círdan's advice, allowing Galadriel to go to Eregion. Celebrimbor meets Halbrand in person because Halbrand remains in Eregion solely to await Celebrimbor's arrival. As they begin to converse, Halbrand successfully provokes Celebrimbor into revealing the truth. It turns out that at that time, Celebrimbor was still unaware of Halbrand's true identity as Sauron. To make matters worse, the letter informing Celebrimbor of Halbrand's true identity, delivered by a soldier of Gil-galad, failed to reach him due to an attack. Halbrand ultimately takes advantage of Celebrimbor's ignorance to deceive him. From this point, Halbrand informs Celebrimbor that the Rings of Power created by him have restored the light of the elf source of power. Consequently, Halbrand requests Celebrimbor's assistance in creating similar rings for the dwarfs and men, so that both can save their world from the encroaching darkness that has intensified since the creation of Mordor. However, Celebrimbor refused because he began to question Halbrand's true identity. To dispel Celebrimbor's suspicions, Halbrand deliberately disappeared for a moment so he could use his magical powers to change his form and carry out his deception. Shortly thereafter, Halbrand returned before Celebrimbor disguised as an elf named Anather. He lied by claiming that Anather was his true identity, which he had kept secret from everyone. Anather even asserted that he was the giver of gifts and the messenger of the Valar, the deity revered by the elves. Anather promised to transform Celebrimbor into a highly respected elf if he succeeded in creating the rings as requested. Deceived by Sauron's trickery, Celebrimbor ultimately agreed to create rings for the dwarfs and men. He then invited Prince Durin to come to his residence, where he tried to convince Durin to accept the proposal regarding the creation of the Rings of Power. As we know, this ring is made of mithril, a rare and high-quality precious metal that can only be found in the kingdom of Khazad-dûm. Therefore, Celebrimbor requested Durin to send mithril so that he could create the ring. Celebrimbor emphasized that this ring could free the kingdom of Khazad-dûm from the food scarcity issues that have arisen since sunlight could no longer penetrate the mountain. Durin was actually considering this proposal, but the problem was that his father, King Durin, would likely reject it because he disliked accepting help from outside the kingdom. Seeing the negotiations reach a deadlock, Anather took direct action with his persuasive skills to influence Durin. As a starting point, Anather introduced himself to Durin as a friend of both elves and dwarfs. He also claimed that Elrond, who had been friends with Prince Durin, often praised Durin during their conversations. Getting to the heart of the matter, Anather assured Durin that if King Durin obtained the Ring of Power, he would not only save his people but also restore his honor. Furthermore, Anather considered this ring to be a golden opportunity for Durin to mend his relationship with his father. After hearing Anather's explanation about the various benefits of the ring, Durin ultimately accepted Celebrimbor's proposal and was ready to convey it to his father. Following the meeting, Anather continued to persuade Celebrimbor to act quickly in creating the ring. Here, Anather pointed out that King Gil-galad had prohibited the creation of Rings of Power, especially if they were to be made for the dwarfs, who had long been disliked by Gil-galad. From Anathar's persuasion, Celebrimbor eventually sent a letter to Gilgalad to inform him that he would be closing his forging facilities. Celebrimbor took this action so that he could create the ring without Gilgalad's knowledge. Shifting to the kingdom of Khazad-dûm, King Durin is now forced to use his reserve food supplies as his people begin to face a famine crisis. To address this food crisis, the king accepted the proposal put forth by his son, Prince Durin, and apologized to his father for not showing him enough respect in the past. The king ultimately forgave the prince's mistakes, allowing them to reconcile once again. Meanwhile, Captain Elendil and his group have arrived in the kingdom of Numenor after successfully escaping the volcanic eruption in Mordor. Elendil was then compelled to free a horse named Beric, as their horse continued to rebel in order to find its original owner, Isildur. If you recall, Elendil's son is believed to have died as a result of the volcanic eruption in Mordor. Afterward, Elendil accompanied Queen Regent Miriel during the funeral ceremony for King Mena, who was also Miriel's father. At the same time, the people were mourning as many soldiers had died in the battles in Mordor. Since learning that Miriel had lost her sight due to the volcanic disaster in Mordor, some of the populace felt that Miriel was no longer fit to be a leader. The same sentiment was shared by Parazon, Miriel's advisor and cousin. Parazon ultimately began secretly gathering strength to thwart Miriel's coronation as queen. In the process, Parazon collaborated with Erin, Elendil's daughter. It turns out that Erin blames Miriel for the tragic fate of Isildur and many other soldiers, leading her to seek Miriel's downfall as an act of revenge. In short, during Miriel's coronation process, Erin revealed Miriel's secret as a user of the Palantir, a crystal ball capable of predicting the future. It turns out that the Palantir is considered a forbidden object because it was created by the elves, who are now despised by the kingdom of Numenor. The people's disappointment grew even larger after Erin claimed that Miriel had sent troops to Mordor due to the influence of the Palantir's prophecy. From this tense situation, a riot broke out during the coronation ceremony. However, shortly after, the chaos ceased when a giant eagle suddenly landed there. The people then voiced their support for Parazon after a supporter claimed that the eagle favored him. Meanwhile, in Mordor, Beric discovered Isildur, who was still alive and trapped in a spider's lair. Once freed by Beric, Isildur fought against the attacks of the spider and orcs, ultimately managing to escape safely. With his new friend named Estel, Isildur is now heading to Pelargir, an ancient Numenorean settlement. Upon arriving there, Isildur hopes to find a ship so he can return to the kingdom of Numenor and reunite with his family. However, Isildur was unable to find a ship and was instead attacked by a group of criminals who were followers of Ardar. Isildur ultimately managed to escape thanks to the assistance of Arondir, an elf who had previously been aided by Elendil's forces in their fight against the orcs. That evening, Isildur attended the funeral ceremony of a resident of Pelargir. It turned out that the deceased was Bronwyn, a healer who had a romantic relationship with Arondir. The next day, Arondir shared that Bronwyn had died from an infection caused by a wound from an orc's arrow. On the other hand, Ardar began preparing his orc army to kill Sauron in order to carry out his mission. Ardar collaborated with a powerful troll named Damrod. Sometime later, King Durin and his son arrived in Eregion to deliver Mithril, as the base material had been acquired. Celebrimbor finally began the process of creating the Rings of Power with Anathar by his side. Meanwhile, in Rhûn, a hunter reported to the Dark Wizard about the great power of the stranger. After receiving this information, the Dark Wizard decided to deal with the stranger, while the hunter was assigned to capture Nori and Poppy. At the same time, the stranger began searching for Nori and Poppy, who had been separated from him due to a storm he had created. During his journey, the stranger encountered a man named Tom. While in Tom's vicinity, the stranger was attacked by a tree, which dragged him inside. Upon realizing this, Tom managed to influence the tree to release the stranger. After receiving help, the stranger was allowed to stay at Tom's house. During their conversation, it was revealed that Tom was an extremely old wizard, even hinting that he was the oldest wizard. Tom had also encountered the Dark Wizard before the Dark Sorcerer became the ruler of Rune as he is now. According to Tom's knowledge, Rune was once a fertile land before it turned barren. When the stranger mentioned Sauron, Tom believed that Sauron and the Dark Wizard were allies. Once they had met and started collaborating, Tom envisioned that the world would be destroyed. He then asserted that he did not want to save the world, as he had chosen to live as an ordinary person. From this point, the stranger felt that he was destined to stop the Dark Wizard and Sauron. Now, the stranger sought Tom's help to train him so that he could become a powerful wizard capable of controlling his abilities. Still in the same land, Nori and Poppy found themselves in the village of the Stir people, who are small in stature like the Harfoots. That evening, the village chief, Gunn, showed Nori a carving on a stone. This image revealed that the ancestors of the Stir were connected to the ancestors of the Harfoots. After examining the image, Nori concluded that her people had once been in that area. Switching to Pelargir, Arondir was searching for Theo, Bronwyn's son, who had suddenly disappeared in the forest area near the settlement. Arondir ultimately decided to continue the search the next day since it was already late at night. While preparing, Arondir managed to uncover Estrid's disguise as a follower of Ardar. Additionally, Arondir revealed Estrid's malicious intent to lead him and the others into the group of Ardar's followers so that they could be easily attacked. In short, Arondir continued the search for Theo alongside Isildur and Istrid, whose hands were handcuffed to prevent her from escaping. While in the forest area, Arondir and Isildur got caught in quicksand. Thanks to Estrid's help, they both managed to escape, but Estrid's actions also caused a monster from the quicksand to emerge from its hiding place. Fortunately, Arondir was able to kill the monster before it could attack the three of them. That night, Isildur released Estrid's handcuffs out of sympathy. Shortly after, the talking and moving tree people, known as Ents, suddenly appeared and went on a rampage while wielding a sword. They were angry because they believed Istrid was going to cut down trees with that sword. In short, Arondir managed to calm the Ents and obtain important information. It turned out that the Ents were currently wary of the Orc army because many trees had been cut down by them in the past. After reaching an understanding with Arondir and the others, the Ents freed Theo and the Ardar followers they had kidnapped. Once the situation was deemed safe, Arondir began his mission to hunt the Orcs that were cutting down trees to fulfill his promise to the Ents. Returning to Galadriel, she was finally ready to depart for a region with Elrond and 3 elf soldiers on a mission to protect Celebrimbor from Sauron. After a long journey, Galadriel's group arrived at a bridge that was the only safe route to a region. However, unexpectedly, this bridge was already destroyed. Given the extent of the damage, Galadriel suspected that Sauron had sabotaged the bridge to prevent anyone from reaching a region. Elrond, as the leader of the journey, decided to take an alternative route by crossing the nearby hills. Upon reaching the hills, Galadriel's group was attacked by a horde of armed undead. It turned out that these creatures were responsible for killing the messenger of Gil-galad, preventing the letter from being delivered to Celebrimbor. During the battle, Galadriel concluded that there was a figure intentionally animating the corpses. Ultimately, Galadriel's group chose to flee, as their physical attacks were ineffective against the undead. Afterward, Galadriel and Elrond rested while discussing the rings. In this moment, Galadriel admitted that she sometimes glimpsed horrific events in her mind since wearing the ring, and she believed that these events would truly come to pass if she failed to stop Sauron. After recounting this, Galadriel asked Elrond to promise to destroy Sauron by any means necessary, even if it meant killing Galadriel herself. She made this request because she feared the world being ruled by Sauron more than she feared dying in the fight against him. That night, Galadriel's group accidentally spotted a large force of orcs led by Ardar moving toward a region. Elrond was now confused about whether Ardar was actually an ally or an enemy of Sauron. Regardless, Elrond felt that this event needed to be reported to Gil-galad immediately, as it signified the beginning of war between the elves and the orcs. Shortly after, an elf soldier under Galadriel's command was struck by an orc's arrow. Galadriel managed to heal the soldier's wound, and when she accidentally placed the ring on the wound, she asked Elrond and the soldier to return to Lindon to report this to Gil-galad. Before they parted ways, Galadriel entrusted her ring to Elrond to avoid the risk of it being taken by Adar. After that, Galadriel attempted to hold off the orc forces alone to allow Elrond to escape. Despite her exceptional combat skills, she was overwhelmed due to being outnumbered. Eventually, Adar approached Galadriel when she could no longer fight back. Sometime later, the 7 rings of power for the dwarf race, which had been completed, were now stored in the kingdom of Khazad-dûm. Durin became the first dwarf king to wear one of the rings, while the remaining 6 rings would be distributed to each of the other 6 dwarf kings. Shortly thereafter, Durin began to use the rings to save his kingdom from a food crisis. With the ring's unfathomable power, Durin was able to magically identify points within the mountain that could be excavated to allow sunlight to reach his kingdom. Prince Durin then warned that these points were actually connected to the foundation walls of the kingdom, and if excavated, the ceiling of the structure could collapse, endangering the inhabitants. Nevertheless, King Durin disregarded his son's warning and took matters into his own hands to excavate the targeted area. As a result, sunlight was finally able to enter the kingdom, and from that moment on, the farmers could resume their cultivation. After successfully resolving the food issue, King Durin held a meeting with envoys from the 6 other dwarf kingdoms. At this moment, Durin reaffirmed his commitment to evenly distribute the rings to the other 6 kings. However, unexpectedly, Durin's commitment came with a rather difficult condition: he would only share his rings if the respective king agreed to share half of their mining profits with Durin. Days went by until Durin made a decision that was condemned by his son. Here, Durin ordered the miners to dig deeper in order to find the hidden gold. The problem was that the area to be excavated exceeded safe limits, and Prince Durin was concerned that this digging would provoke the evil monsters that had long inhabited the depths of the mountain. While talking with his son, Durin shared what he had been feeling since wearing the Ring of Power. Thanks to the ring's power, Durin could now locate all kinds of abundant and untouched natural resources. He also believed that any decision he made based on the ring's power would not lead to negative consequences in the future. Switching to a region, Celebrimbor was very pleased to have successfully created 7 rings of power for the dwarf race. Shortly thereafter, Annatar urged Celebrimbor to quickly create 9 rings for the 9 kingdoms of men, arguing that they needed to combat the growing darkness. However, Celebrimbor refused because humans have a natural tendency to cause harm. This is why Celebrimbor feared that the rings of power would be misused if given to humans. Although Annatar emphasized that some humans could be trusted and were not easily tempted to commit evil, Celebrimbor remained firm in his refusal, as he did not want his creations to lead to significant problems. From this point, Annatar began to devise another strategy to persuade Celebrimbor to create 9 rings of power for the human race. Sometime later, Prince Durin suddenly visited Celebrimbor to discuss the influence of the rings on his father. After observing for a long time, Durin felt that his father had become greedy and unfeeling since wearing the ring. For this reason, Durin believed that the rings possessed hidden powers that could impair the user's sanity. Knowing that the technique for creating the 7 rings for the dwarfs was the same as that for the 3 rings for the elves, Durin ultimately accused the negative effects of the rings to be the fault of their creator. Celebrimbor then shared this issue with Annatar. Cleverly, Annatar pointed out that the mistake Durin referred to was Celebrimbor's act of creating 7 rings for the dwarfs without the knowledge of the Elf King. Annatar also made a statement that seemed to imply that the negative effects of the rings were a consequence for Celebrimbor for deceiving the king to facilitate the creation of the 7 rings. Following this incident, Celebrimbor informed his team of smiths that they would soon be creating 9 rings of power for men. Celebrimbor then emphasized that the 9 rings for men must match the power of the 3 rings for elves, while also correcting the mistakes of the 7 rings for dwarfs. Meanwhile, Elrond finally arrived in Lindon and immediately warned Elf King Gil-galad about the orc attacks occurring in a region. Switching to Galadriel, she was now a prisoner of the orcs. Ardar ultimately forbade his followers from killing Galadriel, as he wanted to ally with her due to their shared formidable enemy, Sauron. Shortly thereafter, Ardar took the time to discuss matters with Galadriel. To Galadriel's surprise, Ardar had gathered a wealth of information about Sauron, including Sauron's false identity as Halbrand, Halbrand's actions that had deceived Galadriel, and Sauron's current position in Eregion. To solidify their alliance, Ardar emphasized that his primary mission was to destroy Sauron, just like Galadriel. Ardar then revealed that he possessed the crown of Morgoth, which Sauron had nearly won. According to Ardar's belief, the combined power of the crown of Morgoth and the rings of power from the elves would be powerful enough to kill Sauron. Therefore, Ardar requested Galadriel to give him her ring to facilitate their main mission of eliminating Sauron. Ardar also emphasized that Galadriel could save Eregion from Sauron if they worked together. However, Galadriel was still unable to provide an answer as she was conflicted about whether to ally with the Orc race, which had long been a major enemy of the elves. Back in Eregion, Celebrimbor had become irritable and forgetful due to his intense focus on the mission to create the 9 rings. His mood worsened as he repeatedly failed to create a perfect ring. The process of making the 9 rings was now stalled due to a lack of mithril, the essential material for the rings. To help maintain Celebrimbor's concentration, Annatar took over Celebrimbor's position as the leader of Eregion. During a meeting with the people, Annatar received news about the discovery of a soldier's corpse guarding the outer region of Eregion. Upon inspection, Annatar found writing on the corpse in the Orc language, leading him to conclude that the soldier had been killed by Orcs. After understanding the meaning of the writing, Annatar quietly realized that his enemies had begun to hunt him down. However, he was confident that his position would not be easily tracked because his enemies were still unaware of Sauron's disguise as Annatar. Switching to Khazad-dûm, the mining group successfully gathered a large amount of gold according to King Durin's wishes. While the king was conversing with his son, Annatar arrived representing Sauron to request mithril in exchange. Annatar promised to provide a wood supply to support the mining activities that the king had been increasingly promoting. Although the king was aware that the 9 rings were crucial in helping humans fight against darkness, he still refused to send mithril. Annatar ultimately left without attempting to persuade the king. Once Annatar had departed, the king informed his son about the reason for his refusal to provide mithril. It turned out that the king was deliberately withholding the mithril supply until the situation in the human world became critical. The king intended to exploit this emergency situation to raise the price of mithril as high as possible in order to gain substantial profits. Upon discovering his father's wicked plan, Prince Durin became increasingly convinced that the ring had corrupted both his father's sanity and identity. Meanwhile, Stranger repeatedly failed to pass the wizarding tests given by Tom. Still believing in Stranger's potential, Tom agreed to give him a final test that would determine whether Stranger could fulfill his destiny as the wizard who would stop the Dark Wizard and Sauron. Tom then took Stranger to a vast location in Run. It turned out that Stranger's final test was to find his hidden magic staff in that location. Days went by until Galadriel finally agreed to collaborate with Ardar to eliminate Sauron. Galadriel then explained her strategy to defeat Sauron while also saving Celebrimbor and the city of Eregion. However, after considering Galadriel's tactics, Ardar began to doubt whether the Elf King would allow him and his forces to remain alive if Sauron were to be killed, as Galadriel could not guarantee their protection. Ultimately, Ardar initiated his own mission to kill Sauron. Galadriel then forbade Ardar from attacking Eregion, as doing so would mean falling into Sauron's trap. After returning Galadriel to her place of captivity, Ardar ordered many of his troops to begin moving towards Eregion. Sometime later, the inhabitants of Eregion fled in fear after seeing the Orc army already on the other side of the river that surrounded the city. Celebrimbor, unaware of the true situation, eventually tried to leave his facility because he had heard the cries of the citizens. At this moment, Annatar was doing his utmost to persuade Celebrimbor to prioritize the creation of the 9 rings above all else. However, Celebrimbor was not swayed at all, as he felt responsible for protecting his people as the leader of Eregion. Shortly thereafter, Annatar used high-level magic to create an illusion that appeared very real. As a result of the illusion, Celebrimbor felt confident that his city was safe and peaceful. From this point, Annatar successfully convinced Celebrimbor to continue the creation of the 9 rings. Annatar then provided a container filled with enough mithril powder to create the 9 rings. Once Celebrimbor returned to his facility, Annatar immediately dispelled the illusion he had created, revealing the true situation in the city. It turned out that Eregion was now in a state of emergency as the Orc army had fired many chunks of volcanic rock at the city. Even though the city was under attack by Orcs, Celebrimbor was still able to focus on creating the 9 rings due to the influence of the new illusion created by Annatar. As a result of this illusion, Celebrimbor felt that the situation outside his facility was calm and peaceful. When he met with Annatar, Celebrimbor informed him that the process of creating the 9 rings would soon be completed. After meeting with Celebrimbor, Annatar left the facility and inspected the condition of Eregion. It turned out that the state of the city led by Celebrimbor was in ruins due to the relentless bombardment of volcanic rock. In the midst of this emergency situation, Annatar successfully deceived all of Celebrimbor's trusted followers by claiming that Celebrimbor did not want to save his people because he had lost his sanity. Believing Annatar's statement, everyone eventually allowed him to become the new leader of Eregion and the commander of the city's forces. After that, Annatar ordered the Eregion forces to fight against the Orc army with an unexpected attack. At the same time, the Orcs repeatedly fired chunks of rock at the hills near the Eregion River. From this attack, a landslide was created that blocked the river, which was then used as a bridge for the Orcs to approach Eregion. At the same time, Celebrimbor had discovered several irregularities within his facility. From this point, Celebrimbor finally realized that he was trapped in an illusion created by Annatar. Once the illusion was revealed, Annatar admitted that he was actually Sauron. Upon learning this, Celebrimbor rushed out of the facility and tried to convince all of his trusted followers that they had been deceived by Sauron. However, with his magical power, Sauron managed to undermine Celebrimbor's statement, causing everyone to continue believing that Annatar was not Sauron. While Celebrimbor was still trying to prove Sauron's lies, he accidentally attacked one of his followers, resulting in the tragic death of that follower at the hands of the Orcs. From this incident, everyone became increasingly convinced that Celebrimbor was no longer sane, leading them to comply with Annatar's orders to make Celebrimbor a prisoner. Unable to resist Sauron any longer, Celebrimbor ultimately continued the process of creating the 9 rings with one of his hands shackled. Meanwhile, Elrond secretly arrived in Khazad-dûm to meet Prince Durin. In short, Elrond requested Durin to send a dwarf army to Eregion to assist the elf forces in saving the city. Durin eventually agreed to Elrond's request. After Elrond left, Prince Durin successfully convinced all the dwarf soldiers to fight in Eregion. Then, in the midst of his preparations before departure, Durin received a shocking report. Recently, King Durin had not hesitated to kill many of his followers who dared to defy his orders. It turned out that the king's command was to mine mithril in a deeper area. Reflecting on this incident, Durin believed that if he did not soon overthrow his father's power, their kingdom would soon be destroyed. For this reason, Durin ultimately cancelled the deployment of his forces to Eregion and redirected them to fight against the king. Back in Eregion, the elf forces led by Elrond finally arrived and prepared to fight the Orcs. However, the Elrond's forces suddenly cancelled their attack when Ardar revealed that he was holding Galadriel hostage. Elrond ultimately agreed to Ardar's request for a discussion. Here, Ardar offered Elrond an alliance, as they both sought to destroy Sauron. However, Elrond firmly rejected the proposal. Believing that Ardar must have a wicked plan, Elrond refused to hand over Galadriel's Ring of Power. Frustrated by this refusal, Ardar ultimately threatened to kill Galadriel if Elrond did not surrender the ring he was carrying. Although Ardar emphasized that he would use the ring to kill Sauron, Elrond remained steadfast in his decision to refuse. Knowing the tremendous power of the ring could tempt its user and change their mind, Elrond felt it necessary to say goodbye to Galadriel before leaving, aware that Ardar would kill her. In this moment, Elrond apologized for not wanting to exchange the ring with Galadriel. After leaving the location, Elrond provided information to his soldiers that was unknown to Ardar. Even though Ardar's forces were 10 times larger than Elrond's, Elrond was still brave enough to fight because he would receive many reinforcements from Prince Durin. Now Elrond and his forces began to fight to protect the walls of Eregion until nightfall, as Durin had previously promised that his troops would arrive the next morning to assist Elrond. As night fell, the Orc forces started to feel overwhelmed and doubted their ability to destroy the walls of Eregion to turn the tide. Ardar ultimately deployed his troll ally named Damrot to initiate the mission of wall destruction. As the giant monster moved toward the target, it launched an attack that killed many elf and orc soldiers. After successfully clearing all obstacles, Damrot began using the orcs' demolition tools to destroy the wall. In short, Damrot's actions were successfully halted thanks to the cooperation of Elrond, Gil-galad, and Arondir. The three great elves ultimately managed to kill Damrot through their combined attack. At the same time, Galadriel managed to escape after unlocking her shackles with a tool that Elrond had secretly given her during their kiss. Now, Galadriel was trying to enter Eregion to rescue Celebrimbor from Sauron. Meanwhile, Celebrimbor took a desperate action when no one was watching. He was willing to break his thumb to forcibly free himself from his shackles. Without Sauron's knowledge, Celebrimbor finally managed to escape while carrying the 9 rings. Shortly thereafter, he was found by Galadriel, who had entered the city through a secret tunnel. In their brief conversation, Galadriel and Celebrimbor acknowledged their mistakes in falling for Sauron's deception, as Sauron was indeed very skilled at deceiving his targets. At Celebrimbor's request, Galadriel eventually left the city with the 9 rings. To aid Galadriel's journey, Celebrimbor ordered his soldiers to attack Sauron. However, with his magical power, Sauron was able to control the minds of the soldiers, causing them to kill each other. Now, Sauron ordered Celebrimbor to surrender the ring. Time continued to pass until Elrond began waiting for the arrival of Durin's forces, as it was now morning. As the orcs started to gain control of the battle, they managed to destroy the walls and enter the city. Meanwhile, Ardar chose to focus on attacking Elrond and easily defeated him. Ardar ultimately succeeded in seizing Galadriel's ring from Elrond's hands. Meanwhile, in Khazad-dûm, Prince Durin decided to fight alone in his effort to stop his father. When he encountered his son, King Durin was in the midst of excavating to uncover an untouched area rich in mithril. Shortly thereafter, the king successfully opened the mithril-rich area and showed it to the prince. While they were still astonished by the abundance of mithril in that place, a giant and powerful monster suddenly emerged from its hiding spot. In the midst of this dangerous situation, the king finally realized his mistake and was willing to relinquish his ring of power. He assured the prince that he was actually stronger than he thought in order to protect his son and their kingdom. Thus, the king sacrificed his life by bravely attacking the monster. Switching to Stranger, he is now in a location that, according to his prophecy, is where Poppy and Nori are. While still searching for them, Stranger is suddenly confronted by the Dark Wizard, who has been waiting for him. In front of Stranger, the Dark Wizard eliminates his hunting envoy for planning to kill Poppy and Nori without his permission. After that, the Dark Wizard assures Stranger that he will regain his original identity if he agrees to follow him. Here, the Dark Wizard also shares that he and Stranger were once members of a group consisting of 5 great wizards. At the same time, the Dark Wizard invites Stranger to ally with him, as that is the only way they can defeat Sauron. The Dark Wizard then admitted that he was determined to become the ruler of Middle-earth once he conquered Sauron. Realizing that the Dark Wizard had evil plans, Stranger ultimately refused to cooperate with him. In retaliation, the Dark Wizard attacked the location, which turned out to be the settlement of the Stir people. On the other hand, the situation in the kingdom of Numenor turned chaotic after Parazon successfully overthrew Queen Myrril and became the new king. Parazon then ordered the soldiers to capture Myrril along with her loyal supporters, claiming they had committed treason against the kingdom. As the soldiers began to apprehend Myrril's supporters one by one, Myrril chose to remain in her residence, as if she were ready to be captured. In the midst of this critical situation, Myrril gave a valuable item to Elendil, who had been her loyal supporter. It turned out that the item was a special sword named Nassel. At Miral's command, Elendil finally fled while carrying out a mission to save Numenor when he had fully regained his strength. After that, Parazon's son, Kemen, arrived in Pelargir with the mission to transform the settlement into a fortress for Numenor. Shortly thereafter, Kemen realized that Elendil's son, Isildur, was still alive. Now, the good relationship between Isildur and Kemen began to fracture after Isildur learned that his father was Parazon's enemy, who was currently being hunted. Amidst this conflict, Isildur was finally allowed to return to Numenor on a ship provided by Kemen. Meanwhile, in Jian, the Orc forces were massacring the citizens as they attacked the city. To end this assault, Galadriel surrendered to the Orcs so that she would be taken before Ardar. At the same time, Sauron continued to torture Celebrimbor to force him to reveal the location of the Nine Rings. However, Celebrimbor refused because he knew that the Nine Rings would be used by Sauron for mass enslavement in Middle-earth. Ultimately, Sauron killed Celebrimbor for still refusing to disclose the location of the Nine Rings. Shortly thereafter, an orc who witnessed this event realized Sauron's disguise as Anatar. Returning to Galadriel, she finally met with Ardar. At this moment, Ardar's face, which had previously been scarred, now appeared smooth. This change occurred because Ardar had gained healing powers from the Ring of Power that Galadriel was using. Ardar then promised that he and his forces would cease fighting if Galadriel would help him kill Sauron. Galadriel ultimately agreed to ally with Ardar because the orc leader demonstrated his seriousness. After returning Galadriel's ring, Ardar was approached by several of his soldiers who appeared to be in trouble. Unexpectedly, some of those soldiers were pretending and ultimately managed to kill brutally. It turned out that the traitorous orc soldiers had switched their allegiance to Sauron, now worshipping him as the new Dark Lord and recognizing him as the new leader of the orcs. Shortly thereafter, the dwarf forces suddenly appeared and successfully drove back all the orcs in the vicinity. Once freed, Elrond received news from the dwarfs that Prince Durin was mourning the death of his father. Meanwhile, Sauron was focused on fighting Galadriel after he managed to seize the crown of Morgoth in this duel. Sauron attempted to undermine Galadriel's resolve by disguising himself as influential figures in her life. Although she was briefly shaken, Galadriel ultimately regained her composure and continued her struggle to kill Sauron. Nevertheless, although Sauron did not use much of his magical power, he was still able to outmatch Galadriel and successfully corner her. While Galadriel was down, Sauron managed to seize a pouch containing the Nine Rings. Galadriel then lost consciousness after falling from a height while trying to escape from Sauron. Meanwhile, Poppy and Stranger realized that their paths in life were very different, and from this, they agreed to part ways amicably. Poppy and Nori then left with the Stir people on a journey to find a new place to live after being abandoned by Poppy. Stranger found his magic staff, which resembled a tree branch, and then went to Tom to inform him of his success in finding the staff. Tom clarified that it was not Stranger who found the staff, but rather the other way around. Since obtaining the staff, Stranger began to remember his true identity again. Now Stranger realized that his true name was Gandalf. Shifting to Khazad-dûm, Prince Durin began to focus on restoring the condition of his kingdom, which was facing many issues due to the negative changes brought about by his father. The prince was then informed of rumors suggesting that he was not the chosen one by his father to inherit the kingdom. As a result of this mixed news, several dwarf nobles were now trying to claim their right to become the new king of Khazad-dûm. Returning to Jian, as the tension of the war there began to ease, Galadriel was found by Gil-galad and Elrond. With the combined power of Galadriel's and Gil-galad's rings, Galadriel's severe wounds from the Morgoth crown were healed. Galadriel then learned that she and the surviving elves from the Eregion War were now in a very safe refuge. Shortly thereafter, Gil-galad sought Galadriel's advice on how to respond to Sauron's actions, which had now spread to many regions in Middle-earth. Feeling confused, Galadriel recalled Celebrimbor's advice that darkness can only be defeated by light. Inspired by this counsel, Galadriel, as the commander of the elven forces, suggested fighting Sauron with conviction. Trusting Galadriel's judgment, Gil-galad began to work on restoring his people's condition so they could confront Sauron with full strength. And this series
Dan
has come to an
series ini pun
end.
akhirnya
I hope
selesai.
everyone understands the storyline this time, and see you in the next storyline. Bye, guys.